The matron of the St. Jude's Foundling Home for Girls, a woman whose face seemed permanently puckered from a diet of lemons and moral superiority, slid the deed across her desk with 2 fingers, as if touching it might soil her. It was my 18th birthday. Freedom, such as it was, came in the form of a single sheet of paper, brittle and smelling of dust and disappointment. "This is the sum of your inheritance, Eliza," she said, her voice as thin and dry as the document itself. "From your grandmother. The one who left you on our doorstep with a name and nothing else." I looked at the paper. The script was dense with legal terms I didn't understand, but a few words stood out, stark and plain. Lot 73, Cinder Valley. A vertical acre of non-arable rock face, inclusive of 1 cave of unknown depth. I looked up at her, my mind a blank slate. A vertical acre. That wasn't land you could plow. It was a wall. A cliff. "It is, by all accounts, worthless," the matron continued, a faint, cruel smile touching her lips. The county clerk laughed when he filed the transfer. He said your grandmother was a known eccentric. A rock witch, some called her. Lived out there alone for 40 years. This is what she saw fit to leave you. A hole in a rock, she stood, signaling the end of my time at St. Jude's, the end of my childhood. I was given a thin wool blanket, a loaf of stale bread, and a canteen of water. My only other possession was my dog, Grit, a German shepherd pup I'd found half-starved behind the kitchens a year prior. He was waiting for me by the gate, his tail giving a single, uncertain thump against the dust. The matron watched from the doorway as I knelt to scratch his ears. "A girl with a worthless dog and a worthless patch of rock," she called out. "The world has little use for either." She closed the door, the sound of the bolt sliding home a final punctuation mark on the only life I had ever known. I stood there in the road, the deed in one hand, Grit's warm fur under the other, and felt the vast, terrifying emptiness of the world open up before me. The inheritance wasn't just a joke, it was a final act of abandonment, a confirmation of my own worthlessness. A vertical acre and a cave. It was less than nothing. It was a grave waiting to be filled. I needed directions. The settlement of Redemption was little more than a single dusty street squinting in the sun, a collection of false-fronted buildings that seemed to lean on each other for support. At the general store, a place that smelled of coffee grounds, oiled leather, and chewing tobacco, I unfolded the deed on the counter. The proprietor, a man with a stained apron and eyes that missed nothing, read it. He grunted. Then he read it again, and a slow chuckle started deep in his belly. He turned and showed it to 2 men playing checkers on a barrel. Soon, all 3 of them were laughing. Not the gentle, friendly laughter of shared amusement, but the hard, barking laugh of men who have found something truly pathetic to ridicule. The old crone's fisher, one of them wheezed, wiping his eyes. Heard she'd left it to some long-lost kin. Didn't figure the poor soul would actually show up to claim it. The proprietor pushed the deed back toward me. "It's 5 miles north of here, girl. Follow the dry creek bed till you hit the canyon. You'll know it by the buzzards. Nothing lives on that rock but lizards and bad memories." They all laughed again. And in that moment, standing in a strange room full of strange, laughing men, holding a piece of paper that declared me the owner of a joke, something hard and quiet clicked into place inside me. They all thought it was worthless. The matron, the clerk, these men. Every single person saw a hole in a rock and nothing more. They saw me, a girl with nothing, and decided I had been given exactly what I deserved. But what if they were all wrong? My grandmother had lived there for 40 years. People don't live in a worthless place for 40 years unless they know something everyone else doesn't. They laughed. But they stopped laughing a few years later when their own crops failed and my worthless fisher was feeding half the valley. If you want to see how a forgotten girl and a hole in the ground changed everything, stay with me. The journey starts now. I folded the deed, nodded once to the silent, mocking faces, and walked out into the sun. Grit fell into step beside me, his presence a small, solid comfort in a world that felt vast and sharp-edged. We had a destination. We had a vertical acre to find. The journey was all there was left. The walk was longer than 5 miles, or perhaps the sun made it feel that way. The dry creek bed was a scar of bleached stones and baked mud that wound its way into the foothills. Grit's paws grew tender, and I tore a strip from the bottom of my dress to wrap them. The landscape grew harsher, the soil giving way to fractured rock the color of rust and bone. Finally, the canyon walls rose up on either side of us, steep and unforgiving. I saw the buzzards, just as the man had said, circling high above on the thermals. And then I saw it. A sheer cliff face, 100 feet of sun-blasted granite on the north side of the canyon, a place where the sun only struck for an hour or two in the late afternoon. My vertical acre. It looked exactly as worthless as promised. But there was one feature that drew my eye. About 20 feet up from the canyon floor, a thick, tangled curtain of green hung against the gray rock. It was a dense mat of vines, thorny and tenacious, clinging to the cliff face in a way that seemed impossible. It was the only living thing on that entire wall. This had to be the entrance. There was no other place it could be. For the next 3 days, that wall became my entire world. I found a small overhang nearby that offered shelter from the worst of the sun and the night chill. My bread was gone on the first day. I had my canteen, and Grit and I found a seep of brackish water at the base of the opposite canyon wall, enough to keep us alive. The work was brutal. The vines were a species I didn't recognize, thick as my wrist at their base and covered in hooked thorns that tore at my hands and clothes. I had no tools but my own fingers and a sharp-edged piece of flint I found in the creek bed. I'd climb the treacherous slope to the base of the vine mat, brace my feet, and pull. My hands were shredded within the first hour, the skin torn away, the muscles in my back and shoulders screaming in protest. Grit would sit at the bottom, whining with a low, anxious sound, watching me struggle. Each vine I tore away felt like a victory. It revealed another small patch of the cold, grey stone beneath. The work was a kind of meditation. Pull, tear, bleed. Rest. Drink. Pull, tear, bleed. I wasn't just clearing a path. I felt like I was clearing away the matron's words, the men's laughter, the weight of my own desolate history. I was tearing away the label of worthless with my own raw hands. On the evening of the 3rd day, exhausted and dizzy with hunger, I pulled back one last, thick tangle of roots. And there it was. Not a grand opening, but a dark, narrow slit in the rock, no taller than my shoulder. A breath of air sighed out of it, cool and damp and smelling of deep earth, of stone and stillness and something else, something faintly sweet, like overturned soil after a rain. It was a smell of life, in a place that was supposed to be dead. I stood there, my hands dripping blood onto the dust, and I smiled. Grit came and nudged my torn hand with his wet nose. I had found the entrance. I had cleared the vines. Now I had to see what lay inside. The darkness inside the cave was absolute. It was a physical presence, a weight against my eyes. I had a few matches and a stub of a candle I'd saved from St. Jude's. Lighting it felt like a holy act. The small flame pushed back the immense dark, revealing a space that was both smaller and larger than I had imagined. The entrance tunnel was narrow, but it opened quickly into a wide, tall chamber. The air was still and cold, a shocking contrast to the baked heat outside. Water dripped with a slow, steady rhythm from the ceiling, echoing in the silence. And the chamber was not empty. Arranged in long, neat rows on the limestone floor were logs. Dozens of them, pale and rotting in the damp air. And from these logs grew the most fantastical things I had ever seen. Clusters of fungi, shaped like shells, like trumpets, like delicate white coral. They glowed with a faint, ghostly luminescence in the candlelight. It was a garden. A hidden, subterranean farm. On a natural stone ledge near the entrance, safe from the dripping water, sat a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it. Inside was a book, a journal bound in worn leather, and a small, sealed tin. I opened the tin first. It was full of matches. A gift. A provision. I opened the journal. The handwriting was precise, elegant, the ink faded but perfectly legible. It was my grandmother's. The first entry was not a greeting, but a statement of fact. The cave provides. The temperature is constant, the humidity perfect. The spores of the Pleurotus austriatus, the oyster mushroom, find a willing home on the aspen and cartonwood logs. They are sustenance. They are medicine. They are currency. The journal was a manual. It was a textbook on mycology, written in the plain, careful language of a scientist. It described every species of fungus she cultivated in the cave, which were edible, which were medicinal, and which were to be avoided. It detailed how to harvest them, how to dry them for preservation, and how to use the spores from mature mushrooms to inoculate new logs. My hunger was a sharp, painful knot in my belly. Following the journal's careful diagrams, I identified a cluster of pearl-white oyster mushrooms. I broke one off. It was firm and cool to the touch. With my flint knife, I sliced it thin and ate it raw. The taste was clean and earthy, like the smell of the cave itself. It was the most delicious thing I had ever tasted. For the next several weeks, the cave was my universe. I learned its rhythms, the slow, silent growth of the fungal colonies. I learned the journal by heart. I dragged in new logs from a stand of dead cottonwoods down the canyon, as she had instructed. Grit, who had been wary at first, seemed to understand. He would sleep curled at the entrance, a faithful guard, while I worked deeper inside by lantern light. I'd fashioned one from a tin can and some rendered fat from a rabbit I'd managed to trap. I was no longer starving. I was surviving. I was a student, my grandmother the teacher, the cave our classroom. It was a strange, lonely, and wonderful education in the dark. The day came when I ran out of salt. It was a small thing, but it felt enormous. I had lamp oil, I had dried mushrooms, but the salt was gone, and the body's need for it is a primal thing. I had to go to redemption. The thought filled me with a cold dread. I packed a basket with the best of my dried oyster and lion's mane mushrooms and walked the 5 miles back to the settlement, with Grit trotting nervously at my heels. In the general store, the same proprietor was behind the counter. He looked at me, then at the basket, his expression a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "What's this?" he asked, poking a dried mushroom with a dirty finger. "Cave fungus," I said, my voice steady. He laughed, the same ugly, barking sound. "And what am I supposed to do with that?" Before I could answer, a woman who had been standing quietly in the corner of the store spoke. She was old, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her black hair streaked with silver and tied back in a severe bun. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace. She came over and looked into my basket, her dark eyes sharp and intelligent. She picked up a piece of the dried lion's mane, turning it over in her gnarled fingers, sniffing it. "Hericium erinaceus," she said, her voice low and raspy. "My mother used these for lung sickness." Made a tea. She looked at me, her gaze direct and unreadable. "Where did you get these?" "I grow them," I said. "In my cave," the proprietor snorted. The old woman ignored him. She looked at the mushrooms again, then back at me. "I am Ophelia," she said. It was not an introduction, but a statement of fact. She gestured to my basket. "I will take these." All of them. She went to the counter and placed a heavy sack of cornmeal, a block of salt, a small jug of lamp oil, and a bag of dried beans on the wood. "This is a fair trade." The proprietor looked from her to me, his mouth slightly open. He said nothing. I packed the provisions into my sack, my heart hammering in my chest. As I turned to leave, Ophelia put a hand on my arm. Her touch was surprisingly strong. "The north-facing stone weeps in summer," she said, so quietly only I could hear. "That's where you'll find the water." Your grandmother knew that. She let go and turned away, leaving me standing there, stunned. She had known my grandmother. And she had not laughed. She had not offered pity or warmth, but she had offered something far more valuable: knowledge. And respect. Walking back to the canyon, the sack heavy on my back and Grit trotting happily beside me, I did not feel so alone. I had made a trade. I had found a link. That first trade with Ophelia was a crack in the wall of my isolation. The next crack came with the changing seasons. The summer that year was a brutal one. The sun beat down on Cinder Valley until the very air seemed to shimmer and bake. The creek that usually ran through the settlement dwindled to a muddy trickle and then disappeared entirely. The corn in the fields turned yellow and brittle before it could tassel. The beans withered on the vine. Dust was the valley's only crop. My cave, however, was an oasis of stability. The deep stone insulated it from the heat, and the slow, steady drip of water from the ceiling never ceased. My mushroom farm thrived in the cool, humid dark, indifferent to the drought that was strangling the world outside. Hunger is a great equalizer. It erodes pride and prejudice with a slow, relentless force. The first to come was a young woman whose husband had been one of the men laughing at me in the store. Her face was tight with worry, her children thin and listless. She didn't make eye contact. I heard. Ophelia said. You had food, she stammered. I have no money, I don't trade for money, I said. What do you have? She had 2 laying hens. We made the trade. She left with a basket of fresh mushrooms, her shoulders a little less slumped. A week later, an old farmer came. He had a reputation for being a hard, unforgiving man. He offered me a sack of seed potatoes, the last of his stock. They won't grow in this dust, he said, his voice rough. Maybe you'll have better luck next year, we traded. Slowly, tentatively, they began to come. They brought what little they had, a jar of honey, a mended shirt, a handful of bullets for a hunting rifle I didn't own but which Ophelia told me were good for trading. The laughter was long gone. It had been replaced by a grudging, wary dependence. I was no longer the crazy cave girl. I was a resource. I was survival. I followed my grandmother's journals, expanding the operation. I learned to identify different kinds of native trees that had fallen in the canyon, dragging the logs back to the cave and inoculating them with spores, just as the instructions described. I cultivated shiitake on oak and enoki on elm. The cave became a complex, thriving ecosystem, a hidden engine of production. I was not their friend. I was not part of their community. But I was no longer an object of scorn. My existence had become a fact they could not ignore. My worthless inheritance was now woven, however strangely, into the fabric of their lives. For years, the mushrooms were the whole story. They were my food, my work, my only connection to the outside world. I thought I understood my grandmother's legacy. It was about survival, about finding abundance in a place of scarcity. But the journals hinted at more. There were passages I didn't fully understand, references to a deeper pantry, for a deeper hunger, and a legacy not of the flesh, but of the seed. I read those lines over and over, feeling a sense of mystery I couldn't quite grasp. One winter evening, rereading a section on the geology of the cave, I found it. It wasn't a map, but a riddle. Where the bear sleeps in winter, and the 5 sisters point to the north, the stone speaks with a hollow tongue. I spent weeks deciphering it. The bear was a rock formation in the main chamber that, from a certain angle, looked like a hibernating animal. The 5 sisters were a cluster of 5 perfectly aligned stalactites hanging from the ceiling. I stood in the spot where the bear's shadow would fall at midday and looked up at the sisters. They pointed directly to a section of the cave wall that looked no different from any other. I pressed my ear against it and knocked. The sound was not the solid thud of limestone. It was a dull, hollow boom. The stone spoke with a hollow tongue. A new energy surged through me. Ophelia had traded me a pickaxe and a crowbar for a large supply of medicinal reishi mushrooms. I fetched them from my small tool cache. It took 2 days of hard, grueling labor, chipping away at the edges of the rock until I could wedge the crowbar in. The stone was a carefully fitted plug, sealed with a natural mortar of calcite. When it finally gave way, it moved with a deep groan, scraping open to reveal a dark, narrow passage beyond. The air that flowed out was different from the damp air of the main cave. It was colder, and so dry it felt like it was pulling the moisture from my skin. I lit a new lantern and stepped through. The passage opened into a smaller, perfectly circular chamber. And inside, my breath caught in my throat. The walls of the chamber had been carved into a series of smooth, deep shelves, reaching from the floor to the high ceiling. And on these shelves sat hundreds upon hundreds of clay jars, each one sealed with wax and labeled with my grandmother's meticulous script. I picked one up. The clay was cool and smooth. The label read, Anasazi beans, red strain. I opened another, Sonoran tepary, white a third, Tarahumara maize, blue kernel. It wasn't a pantry. It was an ark. A library of seeds. Seeds for plants adapted to this harsh, dry land, varieties that settlers in their ignorance had tried to replace with the thirsty, fragile crops of the East. This was the deeper hunger she had written of. Not the hunger of a single season, but the hunger of a people trying to live in a land they did not understand. The mushrooms were just the first lesson. They were the key that unlocked the door. This was the real inheritance. The discovery of the seed vault changed everything. My work shifted from simple cultivation to preservation and study. I spent my days in the cold, dry air of the inner chamber, cataloguing the jars, reading my grandmother's notes on each variety. Her journals were no longer just a farming manual, they were a profound work of ethnobotany. She had spent decades traveling, trading with, and learning from the native tribes of the region, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Tohono O'odham. She had gathered these seeds not just to save them, but to understand the cultures that had created them. She understood that a seed was not just a plant in waiting, it was a story, a history, a covenant between people and the land. My isolated existence took on a new, deeper meaning. I was not just a mushroom farmer. I was the custodian of a living museum. Years passed. My life fell into a quiet rhythm. I worked in the caves, tended a small terrace garden outside where I began to experiment with growing the seeds and made my weekly trading trip to Redemption. Ophelia was my only confidant. I told her about the seeds, and she was not surprised. Your grandmother listened to the land, she said. The others only tried to shout at it. Then the outside world arrived in the form of a man named Alcott. He was a geologist with the Territorial Survey, a quiet, scholarly man with spectacles and a methodical way of speaking. The stories of the cave farm had reached the capital, dismissed as local folklore, but his curiosity was piqued. He arrived expecting to find a quaint oddity. I led him into the cave. He was intrigued by the mushroom cultivation, asking precise questions about the temperature, the humidity, the species I was growing. He understood the science of it, the elegant symbiosis of fungus, wood, and stone. He was impressed. But it was when I took him into the seed chamber that his professional composure dissolved. He stood in the center of the round room, turning slowly, his eyes wide with disbelief. He ran his fingers over the clay jars, reading the labels under his breath. Tarahumara maize. I've only read about this. It was thought to be extinct. He looked at me, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. Do you have any idea what this is? He asked, his voice hushed with reverence. This isn't a farm. This is a repository of life. It's a library of genetic resilience. Your grandmother. She wasn't just an eccentric. My God, she was a visionary. She was a scientist of the first order. He spent a week with me, taking notes, making sketches, treating my grandmother's journals as if they were sacred texts. His official report caused a sensation. The worthless fissure became a site of scientific pilgrimage. Botanists, agronomists, and academics began to arrive. They did not laugh. They came to learn. My grandmother was vindicated by men and women of science who saw in her work not madness, but genius. And I, the forgotten girl, became the keeper of her flame. The arrival of the outside world was a strange and unsettling thing. At first, the scientists and academics who came to see the cave treated me as a curiosity, an extension of the strange inheritance itself. They would speak around me, discussing the genetic importance of the seed bank and the unique microclimate of the cave system as if I were a ghost. But one of them was different. His name was Samuel, a young botanist sent by a university back east to assist in cataloging the collection. Unlike the others, he spoke to me, not about me. He asked about my methods, about what I had learned from the journals, about the practical challenges of my life. He listened, truly listened, when I spoke. He had a quiet reverence not just for the collection, but for the work itself. He saw the calluses on my hands and understood them. He admired my grandmother, but he respected me. He had been sent for a summer. He stayed for the autumn. Then he wrote to his university and told them he was not coming back. All my life, he told me one evening as we sat by the entrance to the cave, watching the stars blaze in the black desert sky, I have studied plants that were pressed and dried in books. Here they are alive. The work is alive. We became partners, in the truest sense of the word. We worked side by side, our days filled with the shared language of seeds and soil. We began the great work of reintroduction, carefully selecting varieties of drought-resistant corn, beans, and squash from the vault and teaching the farmers in the valley how to cultivate them. We showed them the old ways, the ones my grandmother had recorded, of planting in sync with the sparse rains, of building small stone terraces to hold the soil and water. The valley began to change. The fields that had been dust for generations began to show patches of hardy green. Ophelia grew old and died peacefully in her sleep. Mr. Alcott passed away, his name forever linked with the Cinder Valley Repository, as it came to be known. I lived a long and full life, a life I could never have imagined on the day I left St. Jude's. I filled dozens of journals of my own, adding my observations to my grandmother's legacy. Samuel and I grew old together, our love a quiet, steady thing, rooted as deeply as the desert plants we tended. Grit lived to a ripe old age, and his descendants always kept watch at the cave entrance. I felt my own life drawing to a close, not with fear, but with a sense of completion. The work would continue. The legacy was secure. My death was not an end, but just another turning of the season, a returning of my own energy to the soil that had sustained me. The cave had provided, just as she had promised. Everyone is handed a patch of ground at the start of their life. For some, it is a fertile field, already plowed and planted. For others, it is nothing but barren rock, a vertical acre of impossibility. The world will look at your inheritance, at the dry stone and the tangled thorns, and they will tell you what it is worth. They will use words like nothing, useless, a joke. They will look at you, standing there alone with your worthless patch of ground, and they will laugh. They will tell you to walk away, to find easier soil, to accept the judgment of the world. Your job is not to listen to them. Your job is to look closer. Your job is to see the one patch of stubborn green clinging to the rock and know that it is a sign. It is the marker for an entrance they cannot see. Your job is to put your hands on the thorns and pull. It will hurt. Your hands will bleed. You will be tired and hungry, and you will curse the inheritance and the ancestor who left it to you. But you must not stop. You must clear the vines, one by one, until the hidden opening is revealed. And when it is, you must be brave enough to step into the dark. Inside, you will find what has been waiting for you. It may not be what you expected. It may be a strange and silent garden that grows in the dark. It may be a library of forgotten wisdom sealed in clay jars. But it will be yours. It will be the thing that sustains you, the thing that gives your life its shape and its purpose. The worthless inheritance will become your sanctuary and your strength. So do not despair at the rock and the thorns. Do not listen to the laughter. The world is wrong about you, and it is wrong about your land. Your work is to prove it. Find the entrance. Clear the vines. The cave is waiting.